And the Special Rapporteur is in New York. As you know, it's the third committee. The Human Rights Committee is hearing briefings from Special Rapporteurs, from independent experts. The Special Rapporteur briefed earlier today. Her report was specifically about the interlay between trafficking in persons, gender, and women and security. And a note that the Special Rapporteur, and this is the same of all Special Rapporteurs and independent experts, has a voice that is independent from the United Nations. Special Rapporteur, welcome, and the floor is yours, ma'am.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to give this briefing. My report to the 79th session of the General Assembly looks at the intersections between trafficking in persons and gender, peace and security, extending beyond the attention on women, peace and security to include a wider focus on gender and gender equality, recognising the significance of gender in the realisation of justice, peace and security. And it recalls that the achievement of gender equality requires a transformation of gendered relations of power and inequality, and a recognition of the indivisibility of economic, social and cultural and civil and political rights. The report is presented as we approach the 25th anniversary of the adoption of Security Council Resolution 1325, and it highlights limited progress made in integrating measures to combat trafficking in persons into women, peace and security agendas at UN, at regional and national levels, and presents targeted recommendations to strengthen action to combat trafficking in persons in women, peace and security agendas, with a priority focus on the human rights of trafficked persons and effective prevention and accountability measures, including reparations and guarantees of non-recurrence. We have seen recognition of the existence of trafficking in persons for purposes of sexual exploitation or sexual slavery as a form of sexual violence and conflict, which has increased attention to such risks. Other forms of trafficking in persons for purposes of forced labour, forced marriage or domestic servitude receive less attention, however, which consequently leads to failures to identify, assist and protect trafficked persons and leads to failures of prevention. I have highlighted the limited attention given by the International Criminal Court to trafficking in persons either as a crime of enslavement or sexual slavery or other related crimes. We also see limited attention to trafficking in persons as a violation of international humanitarian law and international criminal law by UN fact-finding and investigative mechanisms, which affects access to justice and to reparations and guarantees of non-recurrence for victims. While some reports of sexual slavery and conflict and enslavement and actions that may constitute trafficking in persons are included in the reports of UN accountability mechanisms, the documentation and reporting lacks consistency. Just 2 weeks ago here at UN headquarters, I presented and participated in the launch of the Office of the SRSG on Children in Armed Conflict study, a joint study on child trafficking and the linkages with the 6 grave violations against children in armed conflict. The study is the first of its kind, and I would urge people to look at the study and to engage with the recommendations to more effectively prevent child trafficking in armed conflict and to strengthen assistance and protection. I also, in the report presented today, highlight the intersections between gender inequality and the incidence of racism in the context of trafficking in persons. We do see that in conflict and post-conflict situations, discrimination and violence against Indigenous peoples, persons of African descent and racialised and minority communities intersect with gender to increase risks of trafficking for all purposes of exploitation, including by armed groups and armed forces and by criminal organisations and networks. And the obligations arising under international human rights law to eliminate direct, indirect and structural racial discrimination are particularly relevant to the application of the non-punishment principle without discrimination. In my report, I've also highlighted the importance of a disability-inclusive approach to responses to trafficking in persons in situations of conflict, including in the context of forced criminality and the application of the non-punishment principle, and in compliance with the obligations arising from the Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities. There has been limited attention to the rights of persons with disabilities in actions taken in the context of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda or in peace-building measures to date. I also want to highlight the incidence of trafficking for purposes of forced labour, which, as we know, has a significant gendered impact, but which receives limited attention in women, peace and security agendas and action plans. Trafficking for labour exploitation can also coincide with other forms of exploitation, including sexual exploitation, and includes both internal and cross-border trafficking. According to ILO child labour estimates, there's also a strong correlation between child labour and situations of conflict and disaster, and that may lead to increased risks of child trafficking. Security Council Resolution 1325 introduced an ambitious agenda aimed at addressing the specific situation of women in armed conflicts and peace processes. We need, however, to see more attention to the objectives of ensuring the participation and leadership of those most affected by conflict-related trafficking in the design and implementation of peace-building measures and in recovery programmes that combine a focus on economic, social and cultural rights, as well as civil and political rights. And I have highlighted in the report the neglect of economic, social and cultural rights, as well as attention to just and fair conditions of work in the W Peace agenda and the impact that that has on prevention and trafficking. I also highlight the failure to identify men and boys as victims of trafficking or at risk of trafficking for all purposes of exploitation, recognising the particular obstacles to recognition of men and boys as victims of sexual exploitation and sexual slavery. I also highlight that LGBT persons and persons of diverse gender identities may face additional risks of trafficking due to discrimination and violence, including in situations of displacement and conflict, and as a consequence of marginalisation and limited employment or regular migration opportunities. My report also highlights the linkages between trafficking in persons and intersections with terrorism and counter-terrorism measures and previous recommendations made to ensure protection of victims of trafficking who may also be victims of terrorism without discrimination. As I highlight, action to combat trafficking requires effective action to strengthen gender mainstreaming in disarmament measures and in small arms control, as has been agreed in global frameworks and needs continued attention. The report highlights also the importance of partnerships with civil society and human rights defenders and their inclusion in peace-building measures and actions to prevent trafficking in persons. And to conclude, I emphasise the linkages between prevention of trafficking in persons and the realisation of the Sustainable Development Goals, as well as the new Agenda for Peace and the importance of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Recalling the global climate crisis and levels of conflict-related displacement and violence, I note that it is urgent to place prevention of trafficking in persons and a human rights-based response at the heart of an effective Women, Peace and Security agenda as we approach the 25th anniversary of Security Council Resolution 1325. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Special Rapporteur. Are there any questions? Please, and Stefano, please, if you could introduce yourself.
I'm sorry, I arrived late, so I don't know if you mentioned that, but I'm interested on the traffickers, the trafficking of migrants. And I mean, did you see a correlation of, because these migrants apparently pay a certain amount of money, a lot of money to traffickers to be transported to the destination. Do you see a correlation on the legislation of several countries means that you know, why paying so much money to and risk your life to traffickers if you could eventually arrive to destination through legal terms if this exists? So in your report, do you have a correlation on how to prevent trafficking, just adjusting legislation?
Thank you very much for your question. This is an important point. I have mentioned the situation of people who are displaced either across borders or internally, or those seeking protection, as well as those pushed into situations of irregular migration in conflict settings and post-conflict settings also. In previous reports and throughout my work, I've emphasised the importance of ensuring access to safe, regular migration opportunities, including through engaging with the Global Compact on migration. I've also emphasised previously in a dedicated report to the Human Rights Council the importance of ensuring that victims of trafficking or people at risk of trafficking in situations of mixed migration have access to international protection and international protection pathways, including through provision of humanitarian visas, expanded resettlement opportunities, rights-based family reunification. And legislation to ensure that is critical and must be applied without discrimination. And limiting access to safe, regular migration opportunities, to planned relocation, to access to international protection, including access to asylum, all of that pushes people into situations where they are taking dangerous, risky journeys. That is particularly risky for unaccompanied and separated children. And yes, it increases the potential for trafficking in persons. At the Global Refugee Forum in December of last year, 2023, I presented a pledge on the intersections between trafficking in persons and refugee protection. And that includes calls on states to ensure effective access to asylum, to expand international protection pathways for people who are displaced by conflict or fleeing persecution. And I have engaged and made submissions on the review processes of the Global Compact on Migration to also emphasise this is the best way to prevent trafficking in persons by ensuring safe migration, planned relocation, for example, in the context of climate displacement, and effective access to asylum, resettlement opportunities without discrimination. Yeah, thank you.
I don't see any additional questions in the room, and I don't see any online. Thank you very much, Special Rapporteur.